Thing happened many years ago. I was the school board chairman in Dalton, Georgia, and the librarian came up to me one day and she said, "I wish you could talk to my son. My son has a real problem. My son is moving back from California and he's got this crazy idea that he's going to build a sailboat and live on a sailboat with his family. Can you please talk to him?" I said, "I would be more than happy to talk to him. I think it's a fantastic idea." And so I met the Holbrook family, and Tim and I soon, first time we met, we were sailing buddies, and we were sailing buddies for quite some time. Tim never completed the sailboat because he had a call to be a missionary in the Philippines through Adventist Frontier Missions. Tim and his family left. John, his son, was I think 8 years old at the time. And John is our speaker today. John spent most of his life in the Philippines. In fact, when he got to Bryson City this morning, he said, "I really struggle with English." He doesn't speak English enough to where he really struggles with what's the next word or whatever the struggle is. I only have one language to deal with. But John has been in the Philippines for, like I say, most of his life. But he's learned something there that I believe can be life-changing for each and every one of us. He's learned something there, captured something in his life that I believe God has planned for each and every one of us. And so, John, I just want to thank you for coming and being with us. And I'd like to have prayer before he begins. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you, Father, that you had a plan for John's life. And I thank you, Father, that you have a plan for each and every one of our lives today. I pray, Lord, that as John speaks, that your Holy Spirit will do the translating, that your Holy Spirit will speak to our hearts, that the vision you gave John will be our vision also here in Franklin. Thank you, Father, for hearing. We surrender this service to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Pastor Marshall, it is good to be here with you guys this morning. And as Pastor Marshall mentioned, I work in 4 languages every day of my life. I speak and write and read in Tagalog, which is the trade language of the Philippines. And I also work in Alangan, which is the language of the tribe where I grew up with my parents. And now the tribe that I'm working with, the Taubuid. And then I also read and write in English, but I never speak it, except for a couple of months every other year when I come back here. So have mercy on my stuttering tongue. But I'm very glad to be here this morning. The story actually starts many years ago, back when just after I first arrived in the Philippines. This is a picture of me and my brother. I'm an only child biologically, and I always wanted brothers and sisters, but never happened. When we went over to the Philippines, though, I discovered a whole village full of kids. Had a lot of brothers and sisters, especially this family. I would always spend time with them, would always go to their house after school, and he became my brother. And in fact, when I went back, where I am now, went back to be a missionary again after college, Delpin, this is the guy in the picture here with me, Delpin and his family moved back with me. And so they're my teammates there, working there with me. And but the story starts when I was about 9 years old. So we'd been there about a year, and I was taking a particularly difficult math course. So I think that probably helped to add to my morbid thoughts. But I started thinking about life and started trying to figure out what it was all about. And I got really depressed over that, because it seemed to me that life was basically eat, sleep, reproduce, and die. And the little bit of joy you got out of it wasn't worth all the pain and all the trouble and all the suffering. If it's just kind of work to feed myself in order to work some more to feed myself some more, what's the point of the whole thing? And I got really depressed at 9 years old. I started thinking, if that's all there is to life, then just fast forward to the end and be done with it. But I figured, there's 6 billion people in the world, and I'm only 9, so surely, everybody else has had these thoughts, and I figured out the answer to it, so I need to hold on until I figure out what everybody else has figured out. And it doesn't mean that I, grew up depressed all the time or a troubled kid, but these thoughts kept recurring to me, kept coming back. It wasn't until I was in my early teenage years that I finally found the answer. Sorry, I skipped a slide there. There we go. So it was actually a couple of years after I was baptized. I grew up in an Adventist home. I had already been baptized. I knew who God was. I knew all about Him. I knew all the doctrines. But something changed that night. It was a Friday night, and Mrs. White and also Paul talks about before communion service how we need to prepare our hearts to find, if there are any, review our lives, see if there's any unconfessed sins, anything that's standing between us and God. And I was doing that night, kneeling in bed, and confessing all of the sins that I knew of, and claiming God's promises of forgiveness, claiming His forgiveness and salvation by faith. And something changed that night. It moved from here down to here. And I heard God speaking to me. Not in my ear, but in my mind. I heard Him speaking to me. And I felt His love, I felt His peace, and the joy that only God can give. And, I've experienced a lot in the world, but I've never found anything that is anywhere near comparable to what I experienced that night. And that some of the stupidest things I've ever done, I've done after that point. But ever since then, I've always known there was something better. I've always had that to look back to, and my heart has always wanted to go back to God. He's always been able to draw me back ever since that point. And, sorry about that. Okay. Technology issues. Ever since that point, I've always wanted to come back, and that night, I found the answer to the questions that I had. I found that there is a heaven to gain and a hell to shun. I found that there is something more than just the suffering that we have in this life, that there's something to aim for, something to shoot for after this life. And I found peace. But at that point, so I grew up actually wanting to get into NASA. That was my intentions. And so I had it all planned out, how I'd get into that and how I'd probably need to get into the Navy first and whatnot. And at that point, I decided that I realized that I probably wouldn't be able to keep the Sabbath if I worked in that career. So I thought, okay, well, then I'll go into mission aviation. But, over time, God started to tell me, that's not where I want you either. I've prepared you specifically to be a missionary on the ground. And I lost the connection with the computer, so I'll just have to tell you when to advance the slides. So we can go on to the next slide there. And that's good. Yeah. Sorry about that. So God started to show me, at that point, I knew that there was a purpose. There was something after this life, beyond this life. But God started to show me that there was a reason for me being here in this world as well. There was a purpose for my life here. If all there is just aiming for heaven after this life, then again, why not just fast forward to the end? Or if life is just about enjoying ourselves, well, we can do that a whole lot better in heaven than we ever could here. And, God could finish the work so quickly. So why is it that we are still here in this world? And God started to show me that He had a purpose for me here in this world. We can go on to the next slide. He started to show me what He had told His disciples 2,000 years ago. And I chose the Young's literal translation here. I did a translation of this in college, but I lost it somewhere. But this translation shows something that you only see in the Greek. There's actually only one active verb in this whole passage. All the other verbs in this passage are supporting that one verb. And that verb is to disciple or to make That is what Jesus told us to do. It was Jesus' last words here on earth to his followers. And we always give special significance to someone's last words. It was his commission, his all-encompassing commission for not just those 12, not just the apostles, but to all of Christ's followers. This is to be our purpose as Christians here in this world. And, you know, when we were baptized, we signed on the dotted line that this would be our purpose in life. You know, if that wasn't made clear to you when you were baptized, I apologize on behalf of those who led you to Christ, but this is the Christian's purpose while here on this world, in this world still. In order to make disciples, we need to go to them, and we need to teach them all things that Christ commanded us. That's, you know, we talk a lot about teaching the doctrines, teaching, you know, Bible studies. That's inherent in this passage. But all of it, and baptizing, all of this is focused on, that's explanations of how we make disciples. Now, does that mean that everybody needs to be a pastor? Or does that mean that everybody needs to be a missionary and go to the jungles of the Philippines? No. If that were the case, then who would keep the lights on? Or who would make these devices that we can come back and show pictures on? Or who would print the Bibles that the missionaries use to teach people? God needs all people from all different walks of life, with all different kinds of talents, different kinds of careers, in order to reach the entire world. You know, as a doctor, or as a nurse, or as a truck driver, or a store clerk, you will be able to reach people that a pastor never will be able to reach. Not only do you have access to people that a pastor or a missionary never would be able to, or would never have access to, but they'll listen to you, where they oftentimes won't listen to us. And you know, other people think that, well, maybe I need a degree in theology. Maybe I need a lot of training. You know, one of the most effective church planters I've ever known was a little man in India. You know, they say in India that there are more bicycles than people. And this guy sits by the side of the road every day repairing people's bicycles. And as he does that, as he repairs someone's bicycle, he just drops a little line. And he says something like, you know, I learned something fascinating about God this morning. And then he stops. He doesn't say anything more. And he waits to see how the person responds. If that person doesn't take the bait, then he says, okay, well, I guess that person's not ready yet. But if he takes the bait and says something like, well, what'd you learn? Well, then he gives a real quick explanation of, say, the creation story. And if the person still seems interested, well, then he invites him to a Bible study. And the way he does a Bible study is very, very simple. He'll read a story, usually starts in Genesis, always starts in Genesis, and works his way through. He'll just read a story. And then he asks 4 questions. First of all is, well, they close the Bible, and then he says, so what was the story? So that helps people to get it in their minds and review it. And then he asks, so what does it mean? And that's the interpretation. You know, what does the story actually mean for me, in my context, in our context? And then he asks, very important question, he asks, so what are you going to do about it? And he has every person make a commitment statement. I will, because of what I learned today, I will do such and such until we meet again, or before we meet again next week. And then the final question, also very important, and oftentimes we leave out, he asks them, okay, so who are you going to share this with? Who are you going to tell this story to again before we meet next week? Just those 4 simple questions. No formal education. But this man has been more effective in church planting than almost anyone else I know. It doesn't take a terminal degree in order to fulfill God's commission to us. You know, Mrs. White also tells a story, and this man wasn't Adventist, but she tells a story of a young man who, when he was in his younger years, he intended to go into foreign missions. But his father died, and he was forced to take over the family business in order to support the family, his mother and his siblings. Well, years later, he talked to one of his friends, and he said, you know, I work for the Lord 24/7. All day long in all of my business relations, I try to represent Christ as best I can. And anybody who's interested, I will lead them to Christ. And then while I'm sleeping at night, well, I have a missionary who works for me in China on the other side of the world. So while I'm sleeping, he's working for the Lord for me in China. And Mrs. White commended this man and said, why aren't there more Adventists who will do what this man is doing? Every Christian is called to make this work our primary life purpose. whatever career, whatever livelihood you have chosen, whatever talents you have, don't make that an end in itself. Our careers are a means to this end, to make disciples for Christ. I'm going to the next slide. So when God convicted me of this, and when I started to realize this is where I was going in life, I started to prepare as best I could. This was early high school. I started to prepare as best I could to be a missionary, to be a foreign missionary, cross-cultural. And it was in my second year of high school. My parents and I were back in the States visiting with the director of Adventist World Aviation. And we were walking around Andrews campus. They had come and visited us in the Philippines. And got to talking about this people group. They were just south of the people group where I had grown up, among the Alangan. And got real excited about them. And so they actually found a sponsor to send somebody back to the Philippines to do a project survey and to get the process going, to send a missionary to them. Well, they couldn't find anybody to go. Couldn't find anybody who knew the language and was healthy enough. My dad was available, but he had chronic malaria at that time. Couldn't go. And so they said, well, why don't you go? They said to me, why don't you go? I said, well, I guess I can. And so I went to the Philippines and went to the Taubuid territory. Well, they didn't want to have anything to do with me. They wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't look at me, There were several times, actually, that we would come into a clearing and we would see we'd see a fire that was still warm. We would see bushes moving where someone had just, disappeared, but you'd never see the people. But I gathered as much data as I could, and I came back to the States and started the process of getting that project going. And, I started thinking to myself and feeling, this is where I really want to go. And I think God has really prepared me to go to these people. I already know one of the two languages that I have to know and whatnot, but I'm only in my second year of high school. I actually considered dropping out of high school and going directly, but my dad wasn't too happy about that, and I did my research and prayed about it and decided I really should finish college. So I figured there's no way that these people will still be unreached by the time that I get through college. Well, I got through high school, chose my electives, chose my reading materials and whatnot to try to start preparing myself already to be a missionary, specifically to the Taubuid. Got into college, still nobody had gone to the Taubuid. Chose my degree and chose my electives and the jobs that I worked to pay my way through school. Again, with the idea in mind of preparing to reach the Taubuid specifically. Got all the way through college, still nobody had applied, and so I applied and went to training, did fundraising, and in September of 2011, I launched to the Philippines to work with the Taubuid people. And I thought to myself, okay, so now I'm going to have, the first time I went, I only had a week. I didn't really know much about them. But now, I know more. I have more time. And, I have medical training. I know one of the languages there. I know how the natives on the island live. This isn't going to be too difficult. Well, I got there, and the people still didn't want to have anything to do with me. They wouldn't let me into their territory. When I did meet some of them outside of their territory, they wouldn't talk to me. If I talked to them, they wouldn't answer back. They wouldn't even look at me. They would just keep on walking by me as if I didn't even exist. So I wasn't getting anywhere, so I enlisted the help of the church leaders among the Alangan where I grew up, and they started traveling back and forth and up and down and all through the Taubuid territory, looking for a village or even an individual who would be willing to just to talk with me even, let alone wanting help. They didn't want my medicine. They didn't want agriculture. They didn't want anything I had to offer, let alone religion. And 6 months of them traveling all through the Taubuid territory, they finally found a village. The village is named Balangabong. And so they Balangabong agreed to let me in. I found out later that they had a village meeting. And they said, okay, let's let this guy in. We'll see what we can get out of him, and then we'll kick him out again. So I didn't find that out until later, but that was the reason for letting me in. So I walk into that situation. We can go on to the next slide. And surprise, surprise, there were some Adventists in this village. Hadn't realized that. Well, it turns out 30 years ago, a Filipina, who lived in the lowlands, but near the highlands, in the foothills there, She would kill a chicken and cook a pot of rice every Sabbath, and would invite them all the tumbleweed down. And who can resist free food? So they would come down, and while they were eating, she would preach at them. And she did that for 13 years before she got her first convert. And, I really appreciate and respect her tenacity and perseverance in doing that. So I arrived, but they didn't really understand what they believed. They didn't really understand Christianity. So when I arrived, well, basically what they did, I say they were kind of like animistic Adventists. They had, they came out of animism, where they have the spirits that pretty much rule their lives, and they have shamans, and they have incantations and chants and different things to manipulate those spirits, mostly to keep them away. And then when they became an Adventist, what they did is they just replaced the spirits with God, and then they replaced all the incantations and different manipulations, they replaced that with the right way to go to church. So you have to stand up at the right time and sit down at the right time and kneel at the right time and sing the right songs in the right order, say the right words, and if you do all that, then you'll be saved. And so I walked into this situation and came even with the district pastor's approval, the conference's approval, and I didn't know how they did church, and so I was immediately branded as a heretic by all the Adventists. So they were going to the district pastor, they were going to the district pastor telling them that I was doing crazy things, and some of it was true, they just didn't understand what I was doing, and some of it was just made up. Then they went to, there were Catholics, there's some Catholics also in the village. They decided that I was prospecting for gold and treasure hunting. There's a lot of Japanese and Spanish treasures still there. And so they decided that's what I was doing, so they spread that rumor around. And, the people are very nonviolent, but they can tear someone down really quickly through gossip. Well, there's some Protestants in the village. That's actually a denomination there. And the Protestants decided that I was an agent for the CIA. Now, they didn't even know what the CIA was, but it sounded bad. So they started sending around rumors that that's what I was. And they actually went to the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples and reported me. Tried to get me kicked out. I used to think that I was just good at handling people, but looking back, so many times over the last 5 years, they've tried to kick me out and tried to kick me out. And it's only by God's grace that I haven't been kicked out. Definitely no cleverness on my part. Well, this story began about a year into this. And this was the house I was living in. It was my first house. And the termites really did a job on it. Within 1 year, everything was rotten. You can see, hopefully you can see the whole house is leaning downhill. There are bamboo poles that are propping that up. If there weren't for those poles, it would have just collapsed on me in my sleep. And they have this mold there. It's actually quite pretty because at night it glows in the dark. So you don't need a nightlight. But it really stinks, and it's really powerful stuff. It'll just eat up your clothes. Your towels will just disintegrate. And, during the rainy season, you can get 100% humidity where it actually starts. If you read on electronics that says, some of the marine stuff can say 100% humidity, non-condensing. Well, over there it condenses. It can rain without, any clouds in the sky. It just gets so humid. Temperature drops a little bit, and the rain just starts falling. And the mold is so powerful, it can actually, etch glass. Etch our microscopes and our cameras. Anyway, at this point, when this happened, I had been sick for 3 months. So sick I could hardly get up off of my mat. I couldn't do anything. We found that my native teammate and I found that we would get real sick, and we would leave, and immediately after we got off the mountain, we would start feeling better. And we would go out, and we would start, we would rest, we would build up our health again. And, some people said it was the mold, but we would start coming back. And before we ever got to the village, just when we started walking up the hill, we would immediately start feeling worse again. And, my sickness, went to doctors, treated myself, did laboratory tests. Nobody could find anything that was physically wrong with me, but I was so sick that I couldn't get up off of my mat. And we finally concluded that it was Satan trying to discourage us, trying to keep us so tied up with our health that we weren't effective in being missionaries there. Well, this particular night, I knew what was wrong with me this time. I had Giardia. And Giardia causes really bad diarrhea and really bad stomach cramping. And I was lying in my mat in the house. And this man came up on the porch. And he says, "Tao po, Brad John." They don't knock, they knock verbally. Don't knock physically, they knock verbally. So, "Tao po, Brad John." Brad is short for brother. So that's what they call me, Brad John. And so I wasn't feeling too good, but I pulled myself up and came out on the porch and tried to lean up against the wall. The problem was the house was leaning back. So I was kind of hunched over like this. And he says, "Brad John, give me 1,000 pesos. My kids don't like the food I brought home for them tonight, and so I want to go out and buy some tinapay," which is like sweet bread and salty snacks, that kind of stuff. Think junk food. And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't have that much money." And as he's talking to me, my stomach is starting to hurt. And I know the time bomb is ticking. I have probably 30 or 40 seconds where it's going to explode, and there's no stopping it. And he keeps on talking. He says, "Brad John, just give me 500 pesos. And I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." And he's looking past me into my house, and I know what he's thinking. Because there's back behind me, inside of my house, I have just a single little LED light bulb, like the kind that you get out of a dome light of a car. And I have that wired up to a battery. And that's for light in my house. And that's the only piece of technology I had in my house at that time. But I know what he's thinking. He's thinking to himself, okay, he has a light bulb in his house, but I don't have a light bulb in my house. So if he really doesn't have money, which I'm not sure, but if he really doesn't have money, then he should sell his light bulb and give me some money. You see, in their culture, they develop, a lot of cultures actually that have been on the edge of survival for many years will develop a system where everybody, it's not quite communal ownership, but everybody has to share everything. You have to share everything you have. And it works really well for keeping people alive when they're on the edge of survival. But once you start coming out of that, it's very difficult to build up their standard of living because everybody, the entire tribe of 27,000, has to come up at the same time. Anybody who gets a little bit ahead is pulled back down again to keep everybody level. And so, I've had people say that that's selfish. To us, that may seem selfish, but to them, we're actually the selfish ones. Because they see, I'm getting ahead, getting a little bit nicer car than everybody else. I really should sell that and distribute the wealth. So it's just a different way of looking at things. But I know that's what he's thinking in his head, that I have this light bulb, so I'm therefore richer, and I have to sell that light bulb and give it to him, give the money to him. And I'm thinking something, too, at this point. I wasn't feeling very well, and was a little bit frustrated. I'm thinking to myself, yeah, and yesterday the government gave you 2,000 pesos in welfare money, and you squandered it. You spent the whole 2,000 pesos in one day on expensive restaurants and buying cell phone and buying expensive food to bring home. Spent the entire, I could live on a month for that. And you spent it all in one day, and now you're asking me for money. And, I ordered roofing grass from you 2 months ago, and I paid you in advance, and you still haven't delivered the roofing grass. Maybe if you delivered the roofing grass so I could fix my house up, maybe I'd feel a little bit more lenient. I didn't say that, but that's what I was thinking in my mind. And he said, "Brad John, just give me 200 pesos. And it was really hurting by this point. I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." He just turned around and walked off the porch, without saying goodbye. Very, very rude in their culture to not take your leave before leaving. But I didn't care. I was glad it was night, because their only bathroom in the village at that time was about a football field away, and I wasn't going to make it. I took off that porch as fast as I could and found the nearest gully, and I took care of business. But it took probably about half an hour, and by the time I came back, I was white as a sheet, shaking like a leaf. When your intestines cramp, it can put my mom calls it the vasovagal effect. It kind of puts pressure on one of the nerves, and I felt like I was going to pass out. And it was really, really shaky. I finally make it back up onto my porch, but there's one more step to get up into my house, and I couldn't make it up that step. So I just collapsed there on the porch. I'm just laying there. And as I'm laying there, feeling sorry for myself, the church elder comes up, and he's all cheerful, and he says, "Brad John, I just wanted you to know that everybody in the church hates you today." I said, "Thank you, that's all I needed to know right now." And he said, "Yeah, you contracted out for that lumber, to chainsaw that lumber. They freehand chainsaw their lumber there. And you contracted out that lumber, and then you hired one of the church members to haul all of that lumber back down here to the village. What you should have done is you should have taken each piece of lumber, divided it up one piece per person in the village, so that everybody can share equally in the wealth. And I said, well, thank you. At least I know now. At least I know why nobody would talk to me at prayer meeting on Wednesday. And he kind of got a concerned look in his face. He said, are you all right, Brother John? And I said, yeah, I'll be fine. And he said, there were 8 missionaries who tried to reach us before you. Let's see, there was the one who was sick all the time until he couldn't handle it anymore, and he left. And then there was the one who had the moral failing, and he left. And there was the one who stood up in the pulpit and just cursed us out and walked out. We never saw him again. And then there was the one who just disappeared in the middle of the night, and we never knew what happened. Thank you. I distinctly remember why each of the people before me failed. You don't need to remind me. And he says, okay, well, take care. And I went back to his house. At least he was polite in his leave taking before he left. And I'm just laying there on the floor, too weak to get up and start praying, Lord, why? Why do I have to endure all of this? And I'm just spinning my wheels here. There's no point. The people don't want my help. They don't want you. They don't want medicine. They don't want anything to do with me. They're doing everything they can to get me kicked out. What's the point? I had made a commitment that I was willing to give my life in order to reach these people. But at that point, I started to realize that sometimes it's harder to live and to keep on suffering for someone than it is to die for them. And I said, God, why? Just release me. Let me go somewhere else even if I don't go home, just let me go somewhere else. And as I'm laying there, the humidity is like a blanket. It's pressing down on you, and almost you feel like you're smothering. And the smell of the mold, and these ants come. And the ants over there, why the scientists tell us that ants are related to wasps when you get bit by one of these things. They give you big welts, and they really hurt. They hurt for like 10 minutes. And these ants start crawling all over me, and they get up inside of my clothes and biting me inside of my clothes. And I was so weak, I didn't even have enough strength to try to brush them off or to try to, pick them off or smash them or whatever. So I'm just laying there, and tears are starting to roll down my cheeks. And I said, God, just please let me go. And at this point in the mission story, God steps down, and fire falls from heaven. And you see lightning and the miracles, and the natives come up and tell you how their lives have changed because of you being there. At the very least, the missionary feels an overwhelming sense of peace, right? No. Nothing happened. Those ants are still sitting there biting me. I'm still shaky as a leaf. In fact, I start feeling it coming back again. But I started thinking again and remembering, before I went over there, I made a vow. I made a promise to God. I said, I will not leave the Taubuid until one of two things has happened. Either the work is done among them, or that God clearly removes me from that work. And neither of those two things has happened yet. And so I started praying, and I said, Lord, if you want me to sit here and waste the rest of my life, I'll do it. If you want me to suffer like this and just lay on my mat for the rest of my life, if that's what you need, then I'll do it. I will keep my vow. I will keep my promise to you. Still nothing happened. Still no fire from the sky. Still no great miracles. But I did hear a whisper in the back of my mind. And he said, carry on, soldier. Carry on. I don't tell this story. We can go on. I don't tell this story because life is so much more difficult for me than it is for you. Actually, kind of the opposite is why I tell this story. I think missionaries have done a disservice to the people back home by always coming back and telling miracle stories and how wonderful it is. At AFM, sometimes we have missionaries that come through that want to be missionaries because they think, from all the mission stories they've heard, they think that when they're overseas and working in God's work, they'll always be hearing God's voice, always hearing God speaking to them, and always seeing miracles. But it's not always like that. You know, when you participate in the great controversy on God's side, when you do what God has asked us to do and make disciples, Satan doesn't like it. And Satan will attack you as hard as he can. You just have to keep on going. God doesn't always step down and make it easier. Remember Job. God doesn't always answer your prayers. Sometimes he asks us just to endure, just to keep on going without understanding, just like Job did. You know, one of the church leaders over there pointed out to me, he said, you know, if when Satan attacks us and we give up and we say, I can't handle this anymore, that's not going to help the problem, because Satan says, aha, now I know what works. So anytime he wants us to stop, he's just going to do that again and again and again to us. The only way to succeed, the only way to conquer, is just to keep on pushing through until Satan gives up and says, well, it's not going to work. You know, William Carey, the father of modern missions, arguably one of the greatest missionaries, he said, if the biographer gives me credit for being a plotter, he will describe me justly. Anything beyond this will be too much. I can plod. I can persevere in any definite pursuit. To this I owe everything. So when you do start participating in the great controversy, when you do work with Christ to make disciples, expect Satan to push back. Expect there to be problems. Expect to suffer. Just keep on pushing through. Think of it as you're putting deposits in the bank of heaven. We can go on to the next slide. So invariably, after this, people ask me, so did you get better? Well, obviously, I must have gotten somewhat better because I'm able to stand up here. But the short answer is actually no. I didn't get better for quite a while. That particular episode lasted a couple of weeks. The medicines weren't working. I was resistant. Had to actually get my parents to buy me some very expensive medicine here and ship it over there to take care of that. But over the years, my health is like I said, as I didn't give up, just kept on pushing through. Over the years, Satan has dropped that particular trial and has moved on to other things. But my health isn't quite as bad as it was back then. But it was about 2 months after that night that I started my very first baptismal studies there in Balangabong. And I had several candidates, but I invited anyone else also who was interested, who wanted to learn what we believed, to come along as well. And next slide. A young man by the name of Angelo showed up. He wasn't one of my candidates, but he started coming more faithfully than any of my candidates, and coming earlier than any of my candidates. And he actually was an Alangan, so he's from the tribe where I grew up. So we shared, the common heritage and language. So, we said hi, but we were both kind of shy, so we didn't really talk a whole lot. Until one evening, he and I both came especially early, and I guess it got awkward enough that he came up to the front and started talking to me, and he said, you saved my life. And I said, huh? Yeah, you haven't come to the clinic yet. I've hardly even met you. How did I save your life? And he started telling me a story. So go back years ago, when I was still a kid, middle elementary school, my mom taught me how to use her medical books and to do very simple diagnosis and treatment so that when they traveled, if there was an emergency, I could try at least to help. Well, Angelo was just a baby back then. And his parents, he got very, very sick, and his parents took him to Pandarukan, where we were living, and my parents were gone. And so they were hopeless, had no hope. The hospitals now are quite a bit better, but back then they wouldn't have anything to do with the natives. I remember we had a lady who came to Mom 14 months pregnant. And Mom said, I can't handle this. And so for some reason, she couldn't go, so she asked Dad to take her into the hospital. And so he took her to the hospital, the district hospital, the provincial hospital for the whole region. And the doctor, when they got in there, the doctor stopped them at the door and said, I know what's wrong with her, that's far enough, don't come in, and wrote her out a prescription for Tylenol and sent her home. And Dad was not very happy, but did what we could, and by God's grace, she lived. But Angelo, his parents knew that if we couldn't help him, there was no hope. And so they were ready to go home and just wait till he died. But the people said, well, go up to the missionary's house. Their son is still there, and see if he can help you. And so they did. They came up, and so I cracked out my books, or my mom's books, and figured out as best I could what was wrong with him. He had really bad pneumonia, and tried to figure out a treatment for him, gave him some medicine, and they went back home again, and I never heard back from them. Well, apparently, he didn't die. He got better. I tend to think that it probably wasn't because of my medicine. I think God intervened in his life. But anyway, he lived. And all those years growing up, his parents kept telling him this story over and over again. And they would tell him, if you can ever find that guy again, you have to be whatever he is. Okay. So fast forward a few years, and so I had left the Philippines, come back to the States, gotten my degree, I went to college. I had actually gotten a couple of calls here in the States, one in Thailand, and turned those down. Went back to the Philippines, but not to the tribe where I grew up, not where Angelo was. I went to, sorry, we can go on to the next slide. This is me practicing my medical skills as a kid. So 17 years, approximately 17 years after I first met Angelo, I came back to the Philippines, but to a different tribe. Went right past the tribe where I grew up to a different tribe. And when I came to the Taubid tribe, their tribes are only about 27,000 people. That seems like a lot, but when that's your entire gene pool, it can be hard for the young people to find people to marry. So when they discovered each other, because of my going from one tribe to the other, there was a rash of weddings. And one of the young girls from Balangabong, where I grew up, or where I was working, went back to the Alangan territory, where I had grown up, but not to the village that I lived in, to a village I almost never went to. She found this young man, Angelo, and hooked him, married him, brought him back to the village where I was now working. And when he came back to the village, when he came to that village, he saw me and he recognized me. He had never met me since he was an infant. He had never seen me since he was an infant. But somehow, he recognized me right away. But he didn't say anything. He bided his time. And when he heard that I was holding these Bible studies, he came. He said, that's what I need to do. And he came, and he was my most faithful student. We can go on to the next slide. And a couple months later, at our native camp meeting, where we get all the different tribes, all the believers from the different tribes together, Angelo was baptized. One more slide. Yeah. Sometimes when we do participate in the Great Controversy, sometimes when we do work to make disciples, it can get discouraging. For Angelo, it was 17 years and a lot of back and forth and near misses. But God brought us together all those years later. And the seed that was planted back when I was just a kid, didn't know what I was doing, God brought that to fruition, germinated and bore fruit. Mrs. White tells stories of, talks about missionaries who have worked in places all their lives and have never seen any results from their work. It wasn't until after the missionary died that the gospel took off. And oftentimes when that happens, the entire people group is reached almost at once. God has promised in His Word, next slide, in Isaiah 55, He says, "For as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, and make it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it." Last slide. God has promised, and God does not break His promises. So don't get discouraged. Don't get discouraged. Remember that no matter who you are, if you're a Christian, you are called to make this work, the work of making disciples. You are called to make that your primary life work. In whatever career, whatever livelihood you may have, use that. Use that work to make disciples, to bring people to Christ. And when Satan does attack you, when he does make life miserable for you, don't give up. Keep on pushing through. Keep on plodding, like William Carey says. You will get through this. God will bring you through. And when it seems discouraging, when you get discouraged, when you feel that you're planting seeds and you're witnessing and witnessing, but there doesn't seem to be anything happening, don't give up, because God has promised that His word will not return to Him void, but it will bear fruit. Thank you. Our closing hymn